thought back to the days when her babies were safe in her womb, her mismemory editing in her favour, pretending everything had been well, convincing her the problem had started more recently, and so could be blamed more obviously on someone other than herself or her 3 little angels. It had started after the song, of course it must have. She had placed her trust in the woman of the wood, listened to the whispers of women, allowed her faith in the Lord to waver, but why the babies? She had felt their movement for months, sang to them and waited, calling their names as she told them about the world and everything that waited to greet them. Then one day, after walking in the woods and eating yellow berries from the creeping vines, she woke to feel them laying still in her womb. She had before found it difficult to sleep for more than a few hours at a time before their kicking would wake her. Now she woke feeling heavy, a dark cloud over her head, her limbs tired and fingertips numb. She felt her bump and closed her eyes. "Are you sleeping?" she asked her children, and felt the heat of tears building behind her eyes as she felt no reply. So she did as she had condemned others for doing before her. She sought the wisdom of the woman in the wood, Aunt Avis. Whose aunt she was no one knew, just that the name had wound itself around every tree in the wood, that children sang songs of her, that women sought her for remedies for their pains, and that men had a deep and dangerous distrust of her. Bricktava believed her father and husband, that Avis was no more powerful than she was, that only the Lord would provide. But as she sat with her silent flesh between her trembling hands, she knew what she needed to do. It was a steep climb up the hill to the house. The chimney had been little more than a ruin when she was a child. She would play there with her sisters and pretend to cook at the hearth. Then gradually they would find remnants of food, a pot or a bag of herbs, things left behind by people passing through, or not passing through. Their father forbid them to play outside of the village when a boy not yet their age had been found cold in the wood. Then the stories began to bleed into their passing conversations, a woman building a home in the ruin. She lived alone, weaved bags from the wool of her rabbits, travelled into the village for bread but mostly sustained herself from the fruits of the forest. She sold her wares and with them trinkets, potions, teas, mostly harmless but still against the Lord, and now Bricktava felt the wet of sweat prickling over her entire body as she dragged her large bump up the hill to the house. She sat, her heart pounding in her head and blood rushing in her ears as old Aunt Avis stroked her perspiring flesh and hummed. Her grey bird, a familiar, singing from its perch beside the fire. There was no medicine to ingest, no trinkets to hold and pray over, just a touch and a hum, and her girls began their twisting and coiling inside her like intermingling snakes. A relief, thank God, thank Avis, thank the day and the night. She hurried home in the dark and said nothing. She gave birth to 3 plump and heavy babies, 3 moons later, on the first day of the 5th month, like an unlucky litter of cats in the month of free milkings. The girls had an unnatural weight and stiffness, like father's stillborn lambs. They wailed angrily and became so hot and frustrated that they grew red and screamed. They would not hardly feed from their mother, but did not grow frail. Instead they grew strong and distant from Bricktava. She longed to enter the church and take the sacraments again, to pray and beg the Lord for forgiveness, ask for some guidance, that her babies would be hers again, as they had been before that walk in the wood. She swaddled them in green and blue blankets, their little toes free and wiggling. She rocked them and sang to them, but still she felt that uncanny and unnatural weight. The girls grew more alike with passing years as their appearance differed. Bricktava felt upon looking at them that they had not come from her womb. They did not have her likeness or her husband's. They did not even look alike. One pale with wispy hair and sallow face, her eyes a pale blue so close in hue to the white surrounding them. Another touched by fire, hair and freckles like blood and eyes so dark they hid the pupil. And the third, long black hair hanging heavily from her shoulders as if wet, her eyes challenging and gaze heavy too. They grew insolent, misbehaved, and ignored their parents' guidance. Bricktava read to them how the good wife taught her daughter. And when thou goest on thy way, go thou not too fast. Brandish not with thy head, nor with thy shoulders cast. Have not too many words, from swearing keep aloof, for all such manners come to an evil proof. To which they replied, Come to an evil proof, come to an evil proof, come to an evil proof, their sing-song voices mimicking their mothers. Bricktava taught them how to dress, to cover hair and arms. She taught them how to stand and speak and bow and pray, but soon they stopped even attending the table, gone in the morning before she even woke. What sin did thou commit to birth such wild brood? Whispered her husband, as they watched them weaving between the trees that blocked the moon from view. "What sin did thou commit to birth such wild brood?" they cooed, too far away to have heard his whisper and too young to possibly have matched his tone as they had. Bricktava had long since finished her churching ceremony and so was now allowed back inside the church. She waited until the children were sleeping, listening to their wheezing, heavy-chested breaths and insidious, mindless mumbling. She walked the few minutes from the house to the church, her father hanging his head in the pew, praying himself to sleep. She told him of Avis, of her singing and stroking of flesh, how the children had twisted in her womb upon her touch. He nodded knowingly and held her hands in his own shaking hands. She cried, and then they prayed together for forgiveness from the Lord. Now the truth was out. It spread quickly through the village, and the men began their walk towards the woman of the woods. When the children woke to begin their twisted idlings of the day, they sought out their mother where she sat rocking back and forth before the fire. They pinched her flesh and tugged her hair, and whispered in her ears before leaving the house for the last time. Bricktava walked to the bottom of the village, past the church and past a small pasture of bleating goats until she felt the rushing stream around her ankles, and waded further until she felt the sudden drop. Old Aunt Avis was sleeping when the men arrived. They dragged her from her bed, half undressed and terrified, back to the village where they tied her tightly to a stake and asked her once to confess before setting her alight. She screamed and pleaded for more fire, to be killed more quickly as the embers slowly cooked her in an agonizing death. She did not confess, for she had not committed any sin, as her grey bird watched from the tree line and sang with the 3 daughters, born of dread and death and decay. The stream began to flow up and over the banks, forcing the lambs and goats to seek out higher ground. The townspeople sheltered from the sudden storms inside their homes until the waters had risen so high they could no longer leave them. They climbed onto their roofs and watched as the body of Avis was carried away by the current. It poured heavily for days, people withering away on their roofs attempting to lure their animals away from the safety of higher ground so that they could be slaughtered for food. They shivered and died, and their husbands and wives, mothers and fathers rolled them into the depths and watched them float away. Finally the waters grew so high that they engulfed the houses, and those strong enough to survive attempted to swim against the currents, towards the higher ground where the trees provided some promise of safety. The village was surrounded by a deep and thick forest that in the darkness of night became an impossible labyrinth. Those few who managed to make it out of the water now rushed breathlessly and without much energy in any direction away from the sound of children's laughter. One man, Alexander Haley, stopped to breathe after what felt like hours of navigating with nothing but touch to guide him. He listened to the haunting silence of the forest and the screams of other villagers in the distance. "Please, God, protect me," he prayed. The sound of rain smattering on the leaves of the trees drowned out the anguished cries of his fellow villagers, and he continued on until the sun began to rise overhead. He finally became aware of his direction and made a beeline for the clearing in the trees. The closer he got to freedom, the closer the sounds of little feet running behind and beside him. From the corner of his eyes he spotted red hair, pale faces, and felt a heavy gaze upon his neck that made his hair stand on end. He broke from the tree line and spun to face his attackers, but there was no one there, just the swaying trees and the darkness between them. He panted, his own breath and throbbing heartbeat deafening him as his eyes desperately sought the terror he was expecting. He waited. He sat down on the damp ground and felt his clothes begin to dry in the sun as the hours passed. No one else surfaced from the forest. Before the sun set the next day, Alexander gave up on hope and crawled exhausted to the next town. He arrived to see warm Christian faces and welcomed with blankets and food. He told them of Avis, of the children and of the town. They sent search parties to rescue any survivors, but the search parties did not return. Soon people stopped speaking of the town, and it was forgotten.